So were the skeptics right after all? Does science now definitively prove that our pandemic policies were pointless? Actually, what the research really highlights is the complexity of scientific evidence and why it alone can never dictate policy. Those are the words of Anthony Mills, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, senior fellow at the Pepperdine School of Public Policy as well, and a scholar associate of the Society of Catholic Scientists. And you can find his piece, The Masking Debate We Didn't Have, at thenewadlantis.com. Anthony Mills, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm kind of two minds on your piece. I mean, yeah, I agree with you about the complexity of scientific evidence cannot alone dictate public policy because you have to have elected officials take in all the information, understand the trade-offs, and then ultimately make some decisions. But actually, the science on some of these things was fairly well known, like mask wearing. I mean, if you listen to epidemiologists like Johan Gesicki of Sweden, in the beginning, at the beginning of the pandemic, it's not the first time we've had this. The effects of prolonged mask wearing sort of well known because there's been studies about this in the context of factory environments and prolonged mask wearing, the kind of health effects it can have. Just for example, on mask wearing. So, I mean, the science kind of was known, and we kind of took a lark just based on what a few group of quote unquote scientists at places like the CDC and WHO dictated to us, didn't we?
Well, so you're absolutely right. The general point that ultimately policy decisions are political decisions, and political actors have to make them and be accountable for the decisions they make. And evidence can inform those decisions, but it can't dictate them. Now, sometimes there is clear evidence about a given issue, and that point still remains. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind here. And then there are circumstances where there is genuinely contested evidence within the scientific community. And in those cases, it's all the more important, I think, for political actors to be aware of and be honest about what their responsibilities are. And so, too, for the scientists. The scientists have to be sort of honest brokers about what the science shows, what it doesn't show, and on what basis it is that they're making their recommendations.
Well, that was and I'm sorry to interrupt, but that was where the real failure happened, right? Because for those when you've got a study from this outlet and I've got a study from another outlet that draw different conclusions, or draw different, more likely sort of conclusions, and you, because you have the power, silence me. And that's where the debate didn't happen, because anybody who strayed from the orthodoxy, the Jay Bhattacharya's, the Martin Kaldorfs, the Sunetra Guptas of the world, were shut down.
Right. So it's the context in which I'm writing this piece is one where the pandemic is receding, and it was a frustration with a narrative that has begun to crystallize that goes something like this: that we had these policies during the pandemic, now it's over, we can look to the evidence, and we know definitively that those policies were bad. What I want to say is no. During the pandemic, what we had were decisions made in conditions of uncertainty that appealed to evidence such as it was. And critics at the time, rightly often, pointed to the dangers of mischaracterizing that by saying, well, let's just follow the science and get the policy outcome we wanted to begin with. But now that the pandemic is over, those same critics are falling into the same trap of saying, well, now we can appeal to the evidence and say that we get the policy outcomes that we wanted all along. In fact, the situation has always been more complex. And so it's a kind of pox on both their houses. As the debate has continued after the pandemic, it is now clear that there is, in fact, and has been, a long-standing debate among experts about masks as a public health tool. That was very much not a part of the public discussion during the pandemic. But for that same reason, we need to be honest with ourselves now about the complexity of that evidence, the contested nature of it, and what it should mean for political decision-making.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you've got a lot of studies, including meta-studies, that essentially suggest that masks at best are make little to no difference at best. But there are other things too where there was so I'm not sure pox on both their houses. I don't think it's evenly distributed. So you had people, myself included, based on actually people who know the science and data and looking at what they presented in terms of argumentation and evidence, that opposed lockdowns from the beginning. And that was something new. And that was something that had previously been, in previous pandemics, had been raised and rejected. And we did it. And there were people that were opposed to it from the beginning, opposed to it now. And the evidence suggests that those who oppose lockdowns were correct in terms of the trade-offs and on which side of the bottom line the trade-offs would bring us. So that's not a pox on both their houses. That's a pox on the house of the lockdowners.
Well, again, so what I'm trying to do in this piece is not make an argument for a policy. It's to try to argue that the way in which we've been debating these policies has failed us, that we are trying to debate what are fundamentally political decisions as if they can be resolved by science.
Yeah.
And it's on that basis that I say pox on both their houses. Now, there's certain policy issues are more complex than others. If you take an issue like school closures or masks, there are genuine disputes. There were at the time, as you point out, not just in the United States, but across the country, about what the evidence can help us, how it make a complex decision where there are obvious trade-offs. And that was true then, and our public discourse did not accurately represent that fact. And so I certainly don't want to suggest anything to the contrary. The point that I'm trying to make here is that as we assess in retrospect the policy decisions we make, we have to keep in mind the limited role, though important scientific evidence may be, the limited role it ultimately has in helping us make a decision about what is the right call, given what we want to achieve, given what our priorities are, and given what we know and don't know.
In your piece, you talk about the Cochrane Review. What exactly is that?
The Cochrane Review is a recent study that came out from the Cochrane Library, which is a well-respected not-for-profit. And what it does is it's a kind of meta-analysis that looks at the studies that we do have on actually not just masking, but a number of other public health interventions. And this was the study that was pointed to. People would say, well, it turns out actually there's no evidence for masks. But if you look at that study, this is a good illustration of the point that I'm making. It is part of a methodological school that's very well respected and influential in the expert community, but it's one that's not universally adhered to. It applies a certain method to evaluating evidence. I mean, if you look at the evidence that it's considering, the vast majority of it actually is not about masks and COVID. And so we have to be careful on how we, like any other kind of evidence, how we assess the claims that it's making and its relevance for policymaking. And the point, in the piece, I go through in detail how that study works. Its pros and its cons. The ultimate point is, again, a fairly simple one, which is that when we have complex evidence that's contested, we have to be very careful about how we then go about using that evidence to justify political decisions.
Well, right. I mean, and partly is that you don't outsource these decisions to administrative officials that have a very narrow focus of inquiry and weren't elected to do anything other than provide their expert input. And so this is something that where you have to have policymakers, elected policymakers, challenged to live up to their responsibilities.
Absolutely. Ultimately, I think it's sort of psychologically comforting to think that we can outsource hard political decisions to science or to scientists. But it's also strategically useful, right? It allows us to delegitimize the other side. It allows us to bring an end to a debate or a conversation. But ultimately, it's a falsification of reality. That's not, in fact, what it is that political actors are elected to do, and it's not what their citizenry expects them to do.
Well, but I mean, in terms of this idea that you've got people on both sides, and there's real scientific, substantive scientific disagreement, and more inquiries required, and the science has never settled. I mean, that's one of the other specious claims that was made by the left, by Mr. I Am Science and others too. But then you have to layer in the use of the state and actors in service of the state, like social media platforms, that silence debate. I mean, I don't know if you can't have a conversation about the kind of conversation we should have when you have the state putting its finger on one side of the conversation.
Well, it's a genuine. I think one of the things, the outcomes of recent course of events, when you see this new evidence coming out, is this sort of revelation that, well, actually, it turns out it was more complicated, and this fact was not well communicated, to say the least. And in many instances, there were active efforts to mischaracterize that. And there's no question. So, there's no simple fix to this. And, I'm not naive about the fact that our politics is not a philosophy seminar.
Right.
But the fact remains that what we can do as we look back at the pandemic and we try to assess what we did well and badly, I think among the things we have to consider are not just the specifics of our policy, but the way in which we couched the justifications for those policies, because often that was at the basis of what it is you're describing, right? It's a way to obviate responsibility for what, at the end of the day, are very difficult decisions that were made in the course of a pandemic. And it's through that lens that we should be evaluating what we did and didn't do.
He is M. Anthony Mills, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Senior Fellow at the Pepperdine School of Public Policy as well, and a Scholar Associate of the Society of Catholic Scientists. M. Anthony Mills, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
I'm Dave Nissen, CEO of PKF Mueller. As a CPA firm, we have been serving our business clients since 1968 by providing audit, accounting, tax, advisory, and consulting services. We as trusted advisors go beyond what our clients hired us to do by thinking outside the box to understand their operations and industry. We want to discover ways to increase their net income and cash flow by reducing costs or increasing efficiencies. To this end, PKF Mueller provides several client value-added services through strategic relationships. Our partners are specialists and serve the same type of clients that we do and add value by reducing our clients' overall electric and gas costs, discovering inaccuracies and overcharges on utility bills, assisting in financing of real estate, and helping to reduce uncollectible accounts and bad debt expenses. To learn more about our value